The first time I met Karen Ellsworth, she was already frowning. I had just moved into Maple Ridge Estates, a suburban neighborhood in Phoenix, Arizona, and was settling into my new home, a cozy, single-story house with an accessible ramp leading to my front door. Karen, a sharp-featured woman in her late 50s with a perpetually pursed mouth, wasted no time marching up to me as I unloaded boxes from my van. "You're the new neighbor?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Yes," I replied, shifting my weight onto my cane. "Name's David Carter." She eyed my mobility aid with barely concealed disapproval before her gaze flicked to the handicap parking sign standing in front of my house, marking the reserved space by the curb. "You put that there?" she asked. "It was installed by the city," I answered. "I have a permit. I need it." Karen exhaled sharply through her nose. "Well, I'll have to check with the HOA about that. We have rules about unnecessary clutter." I didn't respond. I already knew where this was going. For the next 2 weeks, Karen watched me like a hawk. Every time I parked in my designated spot, she was there, either trimming her hedges, taking out the trash, or just standing on her porch with her arms crossed. Then one morning, as I stepped outside, my stomach dropped. The handicap parking sign was gone. At first, I thought maybe the city had removed it. But then, as I checked the area, I noticed something odd, a small patch of freshly disturbed soil where the signpost had once stood. Someone had yanked it out. And I had a very strong suspicion of who. Later that evening, as Karen watered her flower beds, I approached her. "Karen, do you know what happened to my handicap sign?" I asked, keeping my voice even. She barely glanced at me. "Oh, that thing? I had it removed." I stared at her. "You had it removed?" She straightened up, planting a hand on her hip. "It was an eyesore. This is a nice neighborhood, David. We don't need ugly signs cluttering up the streets." I gritted my teeth. "That sign wasn't for decoration. I need it." She scoffed. "Oh, please. You can walk. I see you walking all the time. You don't need a special parking spot." Anger surged through me. "You have no right to determine what I need." "Well," she said, smirking, "the HOA agrees with me." I clenched my fists. "We'll see about that." 2 weeks later, I attended the next homeowners association meeting, held in the Maple Ridge clubhouse. I had already submitted a formal complaint about my missing sign, and tonight, the issue was up for discussion. Karen sat near the front, looking smug. Then, the HOA president wheeled in. Mark Reynolds, a man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair, rolled himself into position at the head of the room. His wheelchair was sleek and modern, the kind of model used by someone who had long accepted their disability and lived fully in spite of it. Karen's face blanched. Mark glanced at the agenda, adjusted his glasses, and said, "Next order of business, David Carter's handicap parking sign." I stood. My sign was removed without my consent. Mark nodded. "That's a serious violation." "Karen, you were the one who removed it." Karen shifted in her seat. "Well, yes, but it was an unnecessary sign. He doesn't need it." Mark's expression hardened. "Karen, do you have any medical qualifications to determine what David needs?" She flushed. "No, but nothing," Mark interrupted. "That sign is legally mandated. You destroyed city property." Murmurs rippled through the room. By the end of the meeting, Karen was forced to pay the cost of reinstalling the sign out of her own pocket. But Mark didn't stop there. "You will also issue a written apology to David," he said. "And if you ever interfere with his accommodations again, I'll report you to the Americans with Disabilities Act Enforcement Division." Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. I bit back a smile. The war wasn't over yet. But for now, I had won this battle. 3 days after the HOA meeting, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. I knew what it was before I even opened it. Karen's mandatory apology letter. I unfolded the paper, expecting, perhaps foolishly, a half-hearted attempt at remorse. Instead, my eyes narrowed as I read. "Dear Mr. Carter, I regret that you feel inconvenienced by recent events. It was never my intention to cause unnecessary conflict, but I maintain that our community should strive for a visually appealing, uncluttered aesthetic. I hope we can move forward with mutual respect for our neighborhood standards. Karen Ellsworth. I let out a bitter laugh. Not even close to an apology. No admission of guilt. No acknowledgement that she had ripped my sign out of the ground like a weed she found offensive. Just another veiled insult, wrapped in fake politeness. I didn't respond. Instead, I waited. The new handicap parking sign was reinstalled the following Monday, this time with reinforced bolts and a buried concrete base. I watched from my window as the city workers drilled it into place, their expressions unreadable as Karen stood on her porch, arms crossed, glaring at them. That night, I heard the unmistakable scrape of metal against metal outside my house. When I stepped outside with a flashlight, my stomach twisted. My car had been keyed, deep, jagged lines running across the driver's side door. I clenched my fists. So that's how she wants to play it. I wasn't stupid. I knew better than to accuse her without proof. So, the next morning, I installed security cameras, one above my garage and another angled toward the parking space. Then, I waited. For days, nothing happened. Karen still glared at me from across the street, but she didn't make a move. Until one night at 2:37 a.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert. I opened the app, my heart pounding. And there she was, Karen Ellsworth, in a bathrobe and slippers, creeping toward my parking sign with a crowbar in hand. I called the police. When they arrived, Karen was still mid-swing, trying to pry the sign from its base. She didn't hear them approach until one of the officers flicked on a flashlight. "Ma'am, drop the crowbar." Karen froze. Then she spun around, her face red with fury. "This is ridiculous. I live here." The officer didn't waver. "And you're vandalizing city property." This isn't vandalism. It's community improvement," she snapped. The second officer stepped forward. "We have footage of you damaging the sign, ma'am." Karen's face drained of color. "Ma'am," the first officer said, his voice firm, "turn around." Karen took a step back. "You can't be serious." "Hands behind your back." I watched, satisfaction curling in my chest, as the officer pulled out a pair of handcuffs. For the first time since moving to this neighborhood, Karen was speechless. The morning after Karen's midnight crime spree and subsequent arrest, the neighborhood was abuzz with gossip. Maple Ridge Estates was the kind of place where people smiled politely but devoured drama like a soap opera. By the time the sun rose, nearly everyone had heard that Karen Ellsworth had been arrested for vandalism. I sat on my porch, drinking my coffee, watching as my neighbors pretended not to stare at Karen's house. Her front door remained shut. No morning routine, no watering the plants, no passive-aggressive sweeping of her already spotless driveway. Karen was hiding. Good. I wasn't naive enough to think this was over, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a sliver of peace. Then, my phone rang. "David, it's Mark Reynolds." I leaned back in my chair. "Morning, Mark. I assume you heard about Karen's arrest." I smirked. "Hard to miss." Mark sighed. "Look, the HOA wants to avoid legal disputes. We're meeting tonight to discuss next steps. You should come." I raised an eyebrow. "Next steps? We need to decide what to do about Karen. A disorderly conduct charge isn't a good look for our community." "She committed a crime," I said. "Seems pretty simple to me." Mark hesitated. "Some members feel this is a private dispute that shouldn't involve the HOA." I clenched my jaw. Of course. Some people would rather sweep this under the rug than admit Karen was a menace. But I wasn't going to let that happen. "I'll be there," I said. That evening, the HOA meeting was packed. People who never attended these things suddenly had a vested interest in neighborhood affairs. I arrived early, taking a seat near the front. Karen sat across the room, looking pale but defiant, her lawyer, a slick-looking man in a navy suit, whispering something in her ear. Mark wheeled up to the podium. "All right, let's get started." The first 30 minutes were the usual HOA nonsense, landscaping complaints, mailbox regulations, and argument over the proper shade of beige for fences. Then Mark cleared his throat. "Now, we need to address the situation regarding Karen Ellsworth." Karen's lawyer stood immediately. "My client was unfairly targeted and arrested under false pretenses. A murmur went through the room. Mark adjusted his glasses. We have video evidence of her attempting to destroy city property. The lawyer waved a hand. That's irrelevant. My client was merely trying to restore the neighborhood's aesthetics. I let out a short laugh. With a crowbar? Karen shot me a glare. The lawyer ignored me. The real issue here is harassment. Karen has lived in this community for 15 years. Mr. Carter has been here for less than 6 months and already, he's causing problems. I snorted. I'm the problem? I didn't key my own car. I didn't rip out my own parking sign. And I sure as hell didn't try to vandalize city property at 2 in the morning. Mark raised a hand. Enough. Let's get to the point. The HOA board has reviewed the evidence, and we're prepared to take a vote on Karen's standing in the community. Karen's head snapped up. Excuse me? Mark's expression was neutral. We are considering removing you from the HOA. The room erupted. Karen shot to her feet. You can't do that. Mark folded his hands. Actually, we can. HOA bylaws state that any homeowner engaging in criminal activity that disrupts the community is subject to removal. Karen's lawyer turned red. This is outrageous. You can't just vote someone out because they don't like an ugly sign. Mark didn't blink. We're not voting because of her opinion. We're voting because she committed a crime. Karen opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time, she looked nervous. Mark glanced at me. David, do you want to say anything before we proceed? I stood up. The room went silent. I moved here to have a safe, accessible place to live. That's all I wanted. But from the moment I arrived, I've been harassed. My car was vandalized. My sign was stolen. And when that wasn't enough, Karen tried to destroy it again. I turned to Karen. I don't care if you don't like how it looks. It's not about you. It's about my right to exist here, just like everyone else. A few people nodded. Karen's lawyer muttered something under his breath. Mark sighed. All right, let's vote. The decision came down 7-1. Karen was removed from the HOA board, stripped of her privileges, and fined for the damage she caused. Her lawyer's face was like thunder. Karen? She looked like she wanted to kill me. For the next week, Karen was eerily quiet. No glares. No snide comments. It should have been a relief. But instead, it felt like the calm before a storm. Then, one night, my security camera caught something new. A black SUV idled in front of my house for 10 minutes before finally driving away. The next day, a notice appeared on my door. It wasn't from the city, or the HOA. It was from Karen's lawyer. And when I read it, my stomach dropped. Karen was suing me for defamation. I stared at the letter, the words, defamation lawsuit, practically screaming at me from the page. Karen was suing me for emotional distress, reputational damage, and public humiliation. I let out a bitter laugh. Public humiliation? She had done that to herself. Still, I wasn't stupid. A lawsuit, even a frivolous one, meant stress, time, and money. I immediately called Mark Reynolds. She's suing you, he said, incredulous. For what? For apparently making her look bad, I said dryly. Mark scoffed. She got arrested. She vandalized your sign. There's video evidence. What exactly does she think she's proving? I rubbed my temple. That's what I need to figure out. Mark exhaled sharply. This woman doesn't know when to quit. No, I muttered. She doesn't. I wasn't going to fight this alone. I found a lawyer, Jessica Langford, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney who specialized in HOA disputes and frivolous lawsuits. When I met her at her office, she flipped through the paperwork with a smirk. This is garbage, she said. I raised an eyebrow. Legally speaking? She chuckled. Legally speaking, this is a desperate attempt to intimidate you. She's claiming emotional distress over things she did to herself. She has no case. That's good to hear, I said. But will a judge see it that way? Jessica leaned back in her chair. Most likely, the judge will throw this out. But Karen doesn't necessarily need to win. She just needs to make your life miserable until you cave. I set my jaw. Not happening. Jessica grinned. Good. Then let's make her regret this. 3 weeks later, we had our first court appearance. Karen arrived dressed like a victim, soft pastel blouse, conservative skirt, the demeanor of a wronged suburban mother. Her lawyer stood, launching into a dramatic speech about how Karen had suffered deeply because of my attacks against her reputation. Then Jessica stood. She was ruthless. "Your Honor," she said, "this lawsuit is an attempt to silence my client after the defendant was caught on camera committing multiple acts of vandalism. The only person responsible for Mrs. Ellsworth's reputation being tarnished is Mrs. Ellsworth." Karen's lawyer fidgeted. Then Jessica played the security footage. The jury watched Karen, in her bathrobe and slippers, crowbar in hand, trying to pry my sign out of the ground. The judge's expression flattened. And that was it. The lawsuit was dismissed. Karen was ordered to pay my legal fees. After the trial, Karen disappeared for a while. Her lawyer dropped her. The HOA had officially blacklisted her. Her once loyal friends in the neighborhood avoided her like the plague. But I knew she wasn't done. And I was right. One night at 3 a.m., my phone buzzed. Another motion alert. I checked the camera feed, expecting to see Karen. But it wasn't Karen. It was two masked men. One of them carried a can of spray paint. The other had a brick. Before I could react, the first man sprayed something on my garage door. Then the second man hurled the brick straight through my front window. The sound of shattering glass sent my heart into overdrive. I jumped out of bed, grabbing my phone, dialing 911. But by the time I reached the door, they were gone. When the police arrived, we checked the footage. The spray paint on my garage door read, "You don't belong here." I clenched my fists. Karen had escalated. This wasn't just about a sign anymore. This was war. And I was done playing defense. I stood in my driveway, staring at the words scrawled across my garage door. "You don't belong here." The police had already taken photos, dusted for fingerprints, and asked the usual questions. But I could see it in their eyes. They weren't going to do much. "Probably just some punks," one officer had said, jotting down notes in his pad. "Didn't take anything, just vandalism. File a report and let us know if anything else happens." Anything else? I had a shattered window, a garage door covered in spray paint, and a neighbor who had already been arrested for targeting me. And they were acting like this was some random act of mischief. No, I wasn't letting this slide. I was going to find out who did this. And I was going to make them regret it. The next morning, I reviewed the security footage frame by frame. The men wore masks, but their body language told me something. One of them had a slight limp. The other hesitated before throwing the brick, as if unsure whether to go through with it. And then I noticed something else, a car parked down the street, headlights off, watching the whole thing. The car looked familiar. I enlarged the frame. My stomach clenched. It was Karen's SUV. That afternoon, I took a walk, cane in hand, and made my way to Karen's house. Her blinds were shut, but I could hear movement inside. I knocked. Nothing. I knocked again, harder. Finally, the door cracked open. Karen stood there, face tight, eyes darting behind me like she expected to see a cop. "What do you want?" she snapped. I held up my phone, showing her a screenshot of her SUV from my security footage. Her face paled. "Recognize this?" I asked, my voice cold. She scoffed. "I don't know what you think you're trying to prove, but I had nothing to do with your little incident." I stared at her. "Then why was your car parked down the street while it happened?" Karen hesitated. Just for a second. Then she sneered. "Prove it." She slammed the door in my face. Karen thought she was untouchable. That was her mistake. If she wanted to play dirty? Fine. I installed 2 more cameras, hidden this time, one facing her house, another covering the entire street. Then I waited. For days, nothing happened. Until Friday night. At 2:14 a.m., my phone buzzed. Motion detected. I opened the live feed. And there they were. The same 2 men, creeping up my driveway. One of them reached into his jacket and pulled out a can of gasoline. I called 911. Then, I stepped outside. "Hey!" I shouted. The men froze. One of them, the one with the limp, dropped the gas can. The other stumbled back, eyes wide. They weren't expecting me to be awake. The sound of sirens cut through the night. The man with the limp bolted, disappearing between houses. The other tried to run, but he was too slow. The police tackled him before he reached the street. I watched as they hauled him up, handcuffed. And then I saw his face. I didn't know him, but I knew the logo on his jacket. Ellsworth Landscaping. The next morning, the police paid Karen a visit. I watched from my porch as she stood on her front step, arms crossed, feigning innocence. But when they mentioned the man they arrested, Karen's face twitched. It took less than 24 hours for her little hired thug to start talking. By Monday, the police had evidence, text messages, payments, instructions. Karen hadn't just encouraged the attack. She had paid them to do it. And when the cops showed up with a warrant, for the first time ever, Karen didn't come out of that house. She was dragged out in handcuffs. The neighborhood was silent as the police escorted Karen to the squad car. People stood on their lawns, whispering, watching. Karen shrieked at them. "I was trying to protect this community," she shouted. No one responded. She turned, wild-eyed, spotting me standing on my porch. "This is your fault," she screamed. "You're the problem." I just smiled. "Bye, Karen," I said. She lost it. Kicking, screaming, fighting as they shoved her into the car. The door slammed. And just like that, Karen was gone. In the weeks that followed, the HOA officially banned Karen from the community. Her house went up for sale. The handicap parking sign? Still standing. For the first time in months, I could breathe. One morning, I stepped outside and found Mark Reynolds waiting for me. He wheeled over, smirking. "Guess you won," he said. I chuckled. "Took long enough." Mark nodded toward my sign. "You keeping that thing bolted down?" I grinned. "You better believe it." With Karen gone, Maple Ridge Estates felt different. Peaceful. For the first time since I moved in, I could park in my reserved spot without feeling a pair of judgmental eyes drilling into the back of my head. No more nasty glares, no more veiled insults, no more late-night vandalism attempts. Karen's house sat empty, a "for sale" sign stuck in the front yard like a tombstone. But if I had learned anything from this whole mess, it was this. Just because you cut off the head of a snake doesn't mean the venom disappears. And I was right. One afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. At first, I assumed it was just another bill. But when I opened it, my stomach clenched. It was an anonymous note, typed in bold letters. "You may have one against Karen, but you don't belong here. We'll make sure you understand that soon enough." No name, no return address. Just a promise. I looked up and scanned the street. The houses were quiet. The lawns were freshly mowed. The neighborhood looked normal. But somewhere behind those perfectly trimmed hedges and smiling faces, someone still wanted me gone. I wasn't about to let some coward intimidate me. I took the letter to the police. They barely glanced at it. No direct threats. Nothing actionable, the officer said, handing it back. "Could just be some idiot trying to scare you." I shoved the letter in my pocket. "Yeah," I muttered. "Could be." But I didn't believe that for a second. Because 2 nights later, I woke up to the sound of shuffling footsteps outside my window. I checked the cameras. Nothing. But when I stepped outside the next morning, I found deep scratches on my handicap sign. Someone had tried to tear it down. Again. The next day, I got a call from Mark Reynolds. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. We met at a coffee shop outside the neighborhood. Mark didn't waste time. "Karen may be gone," he said, stirring his coffee. But she wasn't the only one who hated that sign. I folded my arms. I figured. Mark sighed. "There's a group in the HOA that still sees you as, how do I put this, an outsider." I clenched my jaw. "Because I need an accessible parking space?" "Because you challenged them," Mark corrected. "Karen may have been the loudest, but she had supporters." I thought back to the 7-1 vote when she was kicked off the board. 7 votes in my favor. 1 against. "You're saying Karen wasn't working alone?" I asked. Mark took a sip of his coffee, then set the cup down with a sigh. "I'm saying," he murmured, "you might have bigger problems than Karen." That night, I did some digging. Karen had been HOA vice president before she was removed. That meant she had allies, people who agreed with her views, even if they didn't want to be as blatant about it. One name stood out. Roger Hale. A retired businessman, Roger was on the HOA architectural committee, which meant he had some control over what was considered acceptable aesthetics in the neighborhood. More importantly, he was the only person who had voted against kicking Karen out. The next morning, I saw Roger standing in his driveway, chatting with a few other neighbors. They glanced at me, and for the first time, I realized Karen may have been the queen of this little power game, but Roger Hale? He was the kingmaker, and I had just become his new target. Roger Hale wasn't like Karen. Karen was loud, obvious, and impulsive, her hatred barely concealed beneath a thin layer of suburban civility. Roger, on the other hand? Roger was calculated. He didn't glare at me from across the street. He didn't vandalize my property in the dead of night. He didn't need to, because Roger had influence, and he was about to make my life a living hell. It started with small inconveniences. My trash bins weren't picked up on garbage day, even though everyone else's were. My mailbox, perfectly within regulation, suddenly got flagged by the HOA for being an improper design. Then, one afternoon, I got a letter in the mail. Dear Mr. Carter, this notice is to inform you that your front lawn is in violation of Maple Ridge Estates HOA standards. Failure to correct the following issues will result in fines: overgrown grass, unkempt hedges, improperly stored mobility ramp. I stared at the letter, my hands tightening around the paper. Overgrown grass? My lawn was perfectly maintained. Unkempt hedges? I didn't even have hedges. And the mobility ramp? That was the real reason for this letter. Roger wasn't just coming for my parking sign. He wanted me gone. At the next HOA meeting, I showed up early. The usual crowd was there: retirees, middle-aged homeowners, a few younger couples who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Roger sat near the front, dressed in an expensive polo, his silver hair neatly combed. He looked like a politician, which, considering how HOA boards worked, wasn't far off. Mark Reynolds wheeled up beside me. You see the new HOA complaint? He murmured. Yeah, I said. Roger's testing me. Mark sighed. Figured as much. He wants you to back down. I smiled. Then he's gonna be disappointed. The meeting started with routine nonsense: budget reports, holiday decoration guidelines, some argument over whether a resident's fence was too modern-looking. Then Roger cleared his throat. I'd like to bring up a matter of community aesthetics, he said smoothly. Here we go. As you all know, he continued, Maple Ridge Estates takes great pride in its uniformity. Our neighborhood has a standard of excellence that we've maintained for over 20 years. A few old-timers nodded along. Roger turned his gaze toward me, his expression unreadable. And yet, some alterations to properties have become noticeable. Some features that, while understandable, may disrupt the harmony of our community. I folded my arms. Just say it, Roger. He smiled like a snake. Your ramp and parking sign, he said, are becoming an issue. A murmur spread through the room. Mark leaned forward in his wheelchair, eyes narrowed. An issue to who? Roger gestured vaguely. We've received complaints. I laughed. From who? You. Roger's expression didn't change. The HOA will be conducting a formal review of your property. I clenched my jaw. I knew what that meant. This wasn't about my ramp or my sign. This was a coordinated effort to get me fined, harassed, and pushed out. Karen might have been the enforcer. But Roger? Roger was the architect of my removal. I left the meeting with a decision already made. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to expose Roger for what he was. The problem with people like Roger was that they hid their corruption well. They never sent threatening letters or got caught with a crowbar in the middle of the night. But every system had weak points. And I was about to find Roger's. Over the next week, I did some research. And what I found was very, very interesting. Roger Hale had been on the HOA board for 12 years. During that time, multiple residents had been fined into selling their homes. Handicap accessible modifications were often denied or delayed. Several property contracts for maintenance and landscaping went exclusively to a single company, Ellsworth Landscaping. Ellsworth, as in Karen Ellsworth. My stomach tightened. Karen was gone. But her business? Roger was still funneling money to it. I had my opening. At the next HOA meeting, I walked in with a folder full of documents. Roger gave me his usual polite, condescending smile. "David," he said smoothly, "I hope you're here to discuss your property compliance issues." I dropped the folder onto the table. "I'm here," I said, "to discuss yours." The room went silent. Roger's expression flickered, just for a second. I pulled out the first set of documents. "Roger, can you explain why 100% of the HOA's landscaping contracts for the last decade have gone to Ellsworth Landscaping?" A few heads turned. Roger tilted his head. "Well, Ellsworth was a reliable..." Ellsworth, I interrupted, was run by Karen Ellsworth, who was forcibly removed from the HOA after she was arrested for vandalism and harassment. Someone whispered. I pulled out the next document. "And why," I continued, "have multiple residents been fined into selling their homes, only for them to be bought up at below market price by an LLC owned by your son?" Roger's face froze. I pressed on. "You've been running a racket, Roger. A system where you fine people, harass them, and make life miserable until they sell at a loss, so your family can scoop up their property for cheap." The room erupted. "You have no proof of that," Roger snapped. I pulled out emails, paper trails, witness testimonies. "Actually," I said, smiling, "I do." The vote to remove Roger from the HOA wasn't even close. Unanimous. By the end of the week, the police were investigating him for fraud. By the end of the month, he sold his house and vanished. Karen was gone. Roger was gone. And my parking sign? Still standing. Months later, Mark Reynolds and I sat on my porch, watching as new neighbors moved into Roger's old house. "So," Mark said, "was it worth it?" I smiled. "Every second of it." For the first time since I moved in, Maple Ridge Estates finally felt like home. With Karen and Roger gone, Maple Ridge Estates was finally peaceful. No more vandalism. No more threatening letters. No more corrupt HOA board members trying to push me out. For the first time since I moved in, I felt like I could breathe. But peace is fragile. And some battles don't end just because you've won a few fights. Roger's house didn't stay empty for long. One day, I stepped outside and saw a moving truck in the driveway. A young couple, Jake and Melissa Reynolds, were unloading furniture, smiling and chatting with a few neighbors. I raised an eyebrow. "Reynolds? As in Mark Reynolds?" Later that day, Mark wheeled over to my porch, smirking. "You're wondering, aren't you?" I chuckled. "You related?" Mark nodded. "My nephew. He and his wife just bought the place. Figured it was time to bring in some good people after all the crap that house has been through." I smiled. Good call. For the first time, it felt like Maple Ridge Estates was finally changing for the better. I should have known it wouldn't last. A week later, I got an email from the HOA. "Dear homeowners, please welcome our new HOA compliance officer, who will be overseeing neighborhood regulations and standards moving forward. Maple Ridge Estates HOA. New compliance officer, Stephen Ellsworth." I nearly dropped my phone. Ellsworth. As in Karen Ellsworth. I pulled up the HOA directory. And there it was. Stephen Ellsworth. Karen's son. The next day, I saw him for the first time. Stephen Ellsworth looked nothing like his mother. Younger, fitter, cleaner cut. A well-pressed polo shirt, khakis, the kind of guy who looked more like a corporate manager than a man here for revenge. But when our eyes met, I knew. That same hatred. That same entitlement. Karen had been impulsive. Roger had been calculating. But Stephen? Stephen was patient. And that made him the most dangerous one yet. Stephen didn't come at me the way Karen did. No vandalism. No screaming matches. Instead, I started receiving HOA violation notices. Every single week. My mailbox was suddenly too high off the ground. My outdoor lights were too bright for HOA standards. My ramp was now a structural modification requiring additional approval. The message was clear. Stephen wasn't just here to take over. He was here to undo everything I fought for. I knew I had two choices. I could play defense. Keep fighting fines, keep arguing at meetings. Or I could take the nuclear option. So I did something Stephen never expected. I ran for HOA president. And when the election came, I won. Stephen's face was priceless. That night, as I sat on my porch, a car pulled up in front of my house. Stephen stepped out. No more fake smiles. No more polished professionalism. Just cold, seething hatred. He walked up to my driveway, stopping just short of my ramp. "You think this is over?" he said, voice low. I leaned back in my chair. "I know it is." Stephen smirked. And then, in the quiet of the night, he whispered, "You have no idea who you're messing with." Then he got back in his car and drove away. And for the first time since this all started, I felt a chill go down my spine. That night, after Stephen's ominous warning, sleep became a stranger. I lay awake in my dimly lit living room, the familiar hum of the night punctuated by the low drone of distant traffic. Every creak of the house, every rustle of wind against the window, set my nerves on edge. I stared at my newly secured handicap sign, its bolts tight, as if it were my only defense against the dark tide rolling in. In the depths of the early hours, the sound of tires crunching over gravel outside sent a jolt through me. I peeked through my blinds and saw a black sedan idling at the street's end, its engine purring as if waiting for a command. My heart pounded. Was this another message? A silent promise that Stephen's war was far from over? I couldn't tell, but one thing was clear: this was no longer just about parking space or petty HOA squabbles. It had become a battle for dignity, autonomy, and the right to live without constant intimidation. The next morning, as dawn broke over Maple Ridge Estates, whispers of discontent fluttered among the residents. In hushed tones at the community garden and over half-finished cups of coffee on porches, people discussed the recent string of minor infractions that now seemed orchestrated by an unseen hand. I received calls from sympathetic neighbors, many of whom confessed they too felt the creeping weight of this shadow council, a faction within the HOA quietly rallying behind Stephen Ellsworth. At the same time, a mysterious envelope arrived in my mailbox, stamped with the insignia of the HOA. Inside was a handwritten note. "Your victory is temporary, Carter. True power resides not in titles but in control. Expect our next move soon." The chilling message confirmed my worst fears. The battle was escalating. It wasn't just Stephen acting alone. He was the mouthpiece for a cabal of residents who'd long nurtured resentment toward anyone who dared defy the established order. They operated in the dark corridors of HOA committees and board meetings, using every rule and regulation to enforce their twisted vision of community perfection. Realizing that I couldn't fight this war alone, I reached out to a few trusted neighbors who had quietly supported my previous battles against corruption. Among them was Linda Morales, a retired schoolteacher with an impeccable sense of fairness, and Jerome Fields, a local mechanic known for his unwavering principles and sharp wit. Both had suffered under the heavy-handed policies of the old regime and were eager to see change. Over clandestine meetings at Linda's modest home, behind drawn curtains and whispered confidences, we forged a plan. Our strategy was twofold: gather indisputable evidence of the HOA faction's manipulations and rally more residents to our cause. Every violation notice, every unexplained fine, every erratic ruling was meticulously documented. Jerome had even managed to extract internal memos from a sympathetic HOA secretary. We knew that once we compiled our dossier, we could confront the board not as isolated individuals, but as a united front demanding transparency and fairness. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for a rainy Tuesday evening. The room was packed with residents, many whose eyes flickered with anticipation and quiet determination. I took my place at the front alongside Mark Reynolds, whose support had been invaluable since the days of Karen and Roger. As the meeting began, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Stephen Ellsworth, newly minted as the compliance officer, took the stage with a veneer of calm professionalism. He reviewed the recent infractions in a clipped, measured tone that betrayed no emotion. But this time, I was ready. I stood up and addressed the assembly, my voice steady and resolute. Ladies and gentlemen, we are at a crossroads. For too long, this HOA has served not the interests of all residents, but those of a select few. I have here documented evidence of fines, of violations that have been engineered to push us all into submission. We deserve to know the truth about how these decisions are made and who benefits from them. Murmurs spread like wildfire through the room. I presented pages of records, emails, and testimonies that laid bare the calculated tactics of the faction, and all eyes turned toward Stephen. His confident facade wavered as the documents were reviewed. A heated debate ensued. Some long-standing members of the HOA expressed their astonishment, while others tried to dismiss my claims as exaggerations. Yet, as the evidence mounted, even the staunchest supporters of Stephen began to question the integrity of the system. In a rare moment of unity, a vote was called, one that would either reaffirm the current leadership or cast them out for good. The vote was tense, the air heavy with anticipation. One by one, residents cast their ballots, each click of the box a quiet act of defiance against years of oppression. When the final count was announced, the results were staggering. A resounding majority demanded the dissolution of the corrupt compliance committee and the appointment of a new, democratically elected board that truly represented every resident. Stephen's face flushed with a mix of anger and disbelief as he was forced to step down. His parting words, barely audible over the murmurs of the room, were a dire warning. You may have won today, Carter, but the forces aligned against you are far from defeated. This isn't over. You've only begun to scratch the surface of what we can do. I met his gaze squarely, feeling both relief and trepidation. The victory was ours, but the threat of retaliation still loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon. That night, as I sat on my porch contemplating the day's events, the rain tapping a steady rhythm on the roof, I couldn't help but feel that the battle had entered a new, more dangerous phase. My life, once a quiet existence defined by routine and simple pleasures, had transformed into a high-stakes struggle for the soul of our community. In the distance, a car approached slowly, its headlights slicing through the darkness. I braced myself, knowing that with each victory, new enemies might emerge from the shadows. The war for Maple Ridge Estates was far from over, and as I tightened my grip on the railing of my porch, I whispered to the night, "I'm ready." The car idled in front of my house for nearly a minute before the headlights flicked off. I stood on my porch, watching. Then, the driver's side door opened. Stephen Ellsworth stepped out. The rain had soaked through his thin button-up shirt, but he didn't seem to care. His face was tight, his jaw clenched as he slowly walked up my driveway. I didn't move. Didn't flinch. This was his last play. His final desperate attempt to assert control. Stephen stopped a few feet from me, his shoes squelching on the wet pavement. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he just stared. Then, finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "You should have left when you had the chance." I smiled. "And let you in?" "Not a chance." Stephen exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. "You think you've won, Carter? You think Maple Ridge is yours now?" I folded my arms. "Seems that way." He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You don't get it. The people I work with, they don't forgive. You've embarrassed them, exposed them. And people like that? They don't go down quietly." I stared at him, my gut tightening. "Is that a threat, Stephen?" His lips curled into something between a smirk and a grimace. "It's a warning." We stood there, the storm whispering around us. Then, without another word, Stephen turned and walked back to his car. He drove away, disappearing into the night. And somehow I knew this wasn't over. The next morning, I met up with Mark Reynolds and Linda Morales. "We need to talk," I told them, setting down a thick folder on the table at Linda's house. She adjusted her reading glasses. "What's this?" I tapped the folder. Proof that Stephen wasn't just some HOA enforcer. Mark leaned forward. "Go on." I opened the file, spreading out documents across the table. Stephen wasn't just working under Roger. He was involved in something bigger. Look at these property sales records. Every time someone was pushed out of the neighborhood, whether by Karen, Roger, or Steven, their homes were bought up by the same LLCs. Linda frowned. What are you saying? I met her gaze. I'm saying that Maple Ridge Estates has been a front for a property laundering scheme. Mark's eyebrows shot up. Jesus. I pointed to the documents. Roger wasn't just evicting people for power, he was clearing out properties so they could be flipped and resold under fake shell companies. And guess who owns those companies? Linda's face paled. Steven? Steven, I confirmed. And Roger. And Karen, before she went off the rails. This whole neighborhood has been their personal cash cow. And now that we've exposed them, they're desperate to cover it up. Mark let out a low whistle. So what's the next move? I took a deep breath. We go public. With Linda and Mark's help, we compiled everything: emails, transaction records, even testimonies from former homeowners who had been forced out. Then, we did something that would finally tip the scales. We sent it all to the local news. Within 24 hours, an investigative journalist had picked up the story. Within 48 hours, a major news network had run a segment on it. And within a week, the FBI was investigating Maple Ridge Estates. The police came at dawn. I woke up to flashing lights, sirens cutting through the morning haze. From my front porch, I watched as law enforcement swarmed Steven's house. He came out in cuffs, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. I could see the headline forming already. HOA corruption ring busted in Maple Ridge Estates. I stood there, arms crossed, as they loaded him into the back of a police cruiser. For the first time in months, I felt true victory. Steven turned to look at me as they shut the door. I gave him a small wave. Game over. In the following months, Maple Ridge Estates changed for the better. The HOA was restructured, this time run by actual residents who cared about the community, not their own wallets. The corrupt fines, the harassment, the intimidation, all gone. And my handicap sign? Still standing. No one touched it again. One evening, as I sat outside, Mark wheeled up beside me, sipping a beer. Feels different now, huh? He said. I nodded. Yeah. Feels like home. He chuckled. Never thought I'd see the day where an HOA scandal led to a federal investigation. I smirked. Hey, at least it wasn't over the color of someone's fence. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset over our quiet, peaceful street. No more Karen. No more Roger. No more Steven. Just a neighborhood that finally felt like it belonged to the people. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm I hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time since moving in. I knew I had won. For the first time since moving to Maple Ridge Estates, I could finally say one thing with certainty: I belonged here. No more HOA corruption. No more threats. No more looking over my shoulder. Just peace. The community had changed. The old guard was gone, replaced by people who actually cared about the residents, not just their own power. And best of all, no one dared touch my handicap sign ever again. As I sat on my porch, sipping a cup of coffee, watching the neighborhood finally thrive, Mark Reynolds turned to me with a smirk. You ever think about running for mayor? He joked. I laughed. Nah. I think I've had enough politics for a lifetime. We clinked our coffee mugs together. The war was over. And I had won.